Okay, I am back. And before I start, for those of you who have not taken a holiday in a long time, highly recommend it. For the first time in years, really, I was able to go off to Europe, take the last 2 weeks off, which of course was a hell of a 2 week period to take off, and completely disconnect. But now I'm back and I'm excited, re energized, a lot going on. Later in the week, I am definitely going to provide my hot take, if you will, commentary on what the current sort of U.S. political landscape may or may not mean with regard to China over the course of the next 4 years. But for today, as the title indicates, I did want to weigh in a little bit on the third plenum. And, I have to smile. It was exactly as we had anticipated. Predominantly a conclave, if you will, whereby all of the messages and all of the reporting leading up to the event was doing nothing but setting up for missed expectations. Because it just continues to be evidently clear to me that those that are tracking the China market sometimes just really don't understand the peculiarities, if you will, of exactly what is going on up in Beijing, especially when it comes to these kind of events. I have to put my glasses on because I did want to read two very interesting quotes. This is from a Bloomberg article. Number one, there is really little in the initial statement that leaves room for optimism or any sort of such interpretation. Number two, easing concerns of foreign business or the middle class were clearly not high on the list. I am, to some extent, a bit surprised that the initial statement doesn't even try to address those concerns. Of course they weren't. It's the third plenum. The third plenum, much like much of the NPC meetings or the party congresses or anything else, are extremely high when it comes to ideas and prescriptions of exactly where it is that the Communist Party of China wants to go in terms of directionality. But very, very little details are ever provided. It's just the Chinese way. And this is no exception. What I do think is important, though, and I think this was brought about not only, I think, in the documentation that came out after the plenum, but you're starting to see it in real time, goes to an earlier video that I did that was titled, Keynes is Dead in China. And we're really beginning to see this sort of deleveraging process that has resulted in an economy that continues to be weak. We saw the GDP numbers come out last week, which were below what was expected. There continues to be softness in the equity markets. That's probably being a little bit polite. But long term, what came out of the plenum was a focus, number one, on the balancing that will continue to be ongoing between the central government's fiscal approach and how that engagement will continue with regional governments. And this is the deleveraging approach. We all are, I think, very well aware that the regional, be it provincial or municipal governments, historically generated the bulk of their revenues from property sales. Not all, but a decent chunk. Now, that still has to be addressed, and that could be a much more important issue down the road. But the first issue that needs to be addressed is the current state of financing, the over-leverage, if you will, amongst many of the provinces, particularly in some of the municipalities. So that was high on the list. But beyond that, what we have witnessed is a decline in M2 growth. Over the course of the past, 15 years or so, we've seen a degree of money supply growth in and around 8% year on year. It jumped to around 12% during the lockdown in 2022. But subsequently, over the last 18 months, there has been a clear trend downwards to now 5%, which, again, I believe this is the case. A 5% year-on-year growth rate for M2 in China is something that hasn't been seen in a very long time. Now, granted, there is still an enormous amount of stock outstanding in money supply. There's no question. Going back years and years, if you're doing 8% even a year, you're going to have a lot of money supply. But I have discovered that many out there, when they're looking at it, trying to make an apples to apples comparison to, say, M2 in the US or M2 in Japan or elsewhere, is China doesn't have as many alternatives for credit creation as exist in other more developed markets, whether it's non-bank financing, even the bond market, as an example. Most credit creation has historically been done through the unfortunate but rudimentary approach of M2. So this coming down is going to continue to put pressure on the economy. It's probably not going, we're probably not going to see much in terms of real vigor, economically speaking, for at least another 6, maybe even 12 months. I continue to view this as being needed. I think most people would view this as being needed. The United States this week is almost assuredly going to pass the $35 trillion mark in national debt outstanding. Debt to GDP of what, 120? So China, I believe, has viewed this as being an existential threat to their own economy, meaning their own leverage, and are doing and taking the steps that they need to take to move forward. It's just going to have an impact. And I think a lot of this came out in the Third Plenum because so much of it was addressed with regard to the fiscal versus regional governments and their finances. Beyond that, things like taxation reform and elsewhere, of course, they really weren't addressed. But what we do now need to keep an eye on is how some of these high-level directives from the Third Plenum will begin to filter down to those institutions responsible for enacting whatever actual policy is expected. That's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on for the next 6 months. But for now, don't necessarily, or you shouldn't, I should say, have expected there to be much in the way of detail. And for the love of God, anybody that's out there saying to you that there is going to be some bazooka of fiscal stimulus, it is not going to happen. Okay? So for now, that's it. I'm glad to be back, and I'll be back in a couple days because I do want to talk about the political ramifications of what is going on with the United States and what this may or may not mean for the remainder of the year. Take care.